Good evening. This is Real Talk, History as a Weapon for Black Liberation, and I'm your host, Sundiata Kaita Chajua. And today's guest is Dr. Ron Daniels. Dr. Daniels is the founder and president of the Institute of the Black World for the 21st Century, which is a progressive, African-centered, action-oriented resource center dedicated to empowering people of African descent and marginalized communities. As the administrator, uh, the Institute of Black World for the 21st Century is also the administrator of the National African American Reparations Commission. IBW has emerged as a leading organization within the U.S. and the global reparations movement. Ron Daniels is a veteran social and political activist. He ran for president of the United States in 1992 as an independent candidate. He served as executive director of the National Rainbow Coalition in 1987 and the Southern Regional Coordinator and Deputy Campaign Manager for the Jackson Campaign for President in 1988. Dr. Daniels holds a BA in History from Youngstown State University, a Master's of Art in Political Science from the Rockefeller School of Public Affairs in Albany, New York, and a Doctor of Philosophy in Africana Studies from the Union Institute and the University of Cincinnati. Dr. Daniels is a distinguished lecturer emeritus at York College, City University of New York, where he taught courses in political science. He is also a prolific essayist and commentator. Dr. Daniels' column, Vantage Point, appears in numerous Black and progressive newspapers and websites nationwide. He also hosts a weekly issues-oriented public affairs talk show on WBIA 99.5 FM on Pacifica Network in New York. And he is the author of Still on This Journey, The Vision and Mission of Dr. Ron Daniels. Let me bring Dr. Daniels in. Ron, welcome. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to have you with me today.
Well, it's delighted to be with you, and we're still on this journey. And again, I was musing because my son is named Sundiata, and every now and then I end up sending you a message for him.
Yeah, that has indeed happened.
That has happened occasionally, but so good to be with my brother and to be a part of this conversation, to see you still very much on the front lines, having played such a significant role in the National Council of Black Studies and making sure that education for liberation as well as history for liberation remains live in the struggle that we're still continuing.
Well, thank you, brother. I certainly appreciate it. Now, Brother Ron, I don't know if you've seen Real Talk, but I always try and begin by helping my audience understand who the guest is and their background. So the kind of questions I begin with are generally biographical. So I want to ask you if you can talk about the time and place in which you were raised and how that affected your time, place, and your class background, and that how that affected what the R&B artist Hank Ballard described as blackenizing. So how were you blackenized and how were you radicalized? And if you can talk about, your background growing up in, I believe, Youngstown, Ohio.
Yeah, I smile because when I do interviews, inevitably the activists and organizers, they go straight to the work. And I do exactly the same thing because we want people to have a sense of how people become who they are, because we don't all become full blown, activists as if we came out of the womb. Maybe some folks do, but not typically. We don't. And as I often, I may well have even begun my book this way by saying I'm the son of a coal miner and a coal miner's daughter. And my story is really a tale of two cities. And those cities are primarily Youngstown, Ohio, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, both of whom are still cities. but I was born in the coal fields of West Virginia, in Beckley, West Virginia, actually. And my father was a coal miner, and my mother was a coal miner's daughter. Her father, Ed Williams, was a coal miner. And in those days, coal was king in West Virginia, even as it is today. And my father was actually a member of the United Mine Workers. He talked about John L. Lewis. There are many people who may not know who John L. Lewis was. John L. Lewis is one of the great labor leaders in the history of this country. And he talked about working. He was a shop steward, actually, with the United Mine Workers in those days, which says something about the degree to which in those days, despite ethnicity and whatever, workers across racial lines actually were involved with each other. But
Ron, can you let our audience know when you say those days, what decade are we
well, we're
talking about?
talking we're talking in the 30s. We're talking in the 30s. I was born in 1942, so we're talking in the actually the other reflection is because both my mother and father were great storytellers, and they told us constantly about their experiences. And so on my mother's side, it was the Great Depression. She talked about the Great Depression, how hard it was, how grinding it was all the time. And my father was born in Georgia. He was born in what we used to call, at least, and we thought it was Talbot County, but it was Talbot County, Georgia. And of course, made his way working in by way of Birmingham and in Kentucky, eventually over into the coal fields of West Virginia, where they met. Um, and so, but they didn't stay there very long. My father had a accident that cut off or injured one of his feet. So he got, I guess, a little bit of settlement. Then he moved to the steel town of Youngstown, Ohio. And then studying and going to the steel town of Youngstown, Ohio, he was began to be involved in the United Steelworkers of America. And he also was someone who was very much involved in the NAACP. And he organized a business, a small Daniel's grocery and confection, because he was a business person. And in Youngstown, Ohio, we organized a store, and a lot of things happened and emanated from that. But again, my mother was someone who went, I think, as far as 11th grade education. And she talked about how brutal and difficult it was coming up in the Depression. And my grandmother a little bit more perhaps charming and loving, but Ed Williams was a very hard taskmaster. I mean, I would even say to something today, we would almost say brutal in terms of his demeanor and the way he acted and functioned, but just very harsh taskmaster. But my mother, was bright, smart. And one of the things I remember distinctly is her talking about leaving the coal fields eventually to go to Washington, D.C. to work in the federal mint. And that's important because what I discerned from that is she would not have been able to do that had it not been for A. Philip Randolph's challenge to Roosevelt, the threat to march on Washington, which really produced the first Fair Employment Practices Act. So my mother had that kind of very bright, very, very able, and very sharp. My father only went to fourth grade, and a slightly different background. And unfortunately, there was a gulf in their ages. He was 20 years older than my mother, and that created some difficulties and some tensions in the relationship. And so by the time I was 9 years old, actually, they ended up divorcing or separating. But on my father's side, he always talked about what it was like growing up in Georgia. And in fact, one of the things that happened is almost every year for 13 years, we would leave out of Youngstown, Ohio, and we would drive to the South. And we would drive through two different routes. Either we would go through West Virginia, where he would meet with old friends and whatnot, or we would go by way of Cincinnati, cross the Mason-Dixon line, and make our way across Chattanooga down into Atlanta, and then ultimately down to Griffin, Georgia. Now, the interesting thing about that was to experience the change of life. I mean, reflecting on and remembering how that was, because my father would tuck a blue steel Smith and Wesson 38 up under the seat, and but to witness a grown man having to ask, can I go to the bathroom? Can we get some food here? Remembering the fact that you had to pack a lunch and your tea cakes and all of that because you never knew where you could actually, in fact, be able to get food and whatever. I mean, all those were things that were seared into my memory as we would travel 13 years in a row to Griffin, Georgia. Now, Griffin, Georgia is significant because it wasn't Griffin, Georgia was kind of like the way station where his sister lived and the Cook family lived. Now that's significant because the Cook family were great. Brother Mannion, as they call it, was a great, what we called in those days, itinerant preacher. Great preacher, well respected. But eventually out of that family, the Cook side, I'll talk about it in a minute. So we would go to Griffin, Georgia. And then after a while, then we would go down into south of Warm Springs, down to Talbot County. And we would meet this Cutton and that Cutton and all the Cuttons. We would go down through in there. But one of the things that was important about that experience is that he also one day took us to a place where one of our relatives was lynched and told us about that story, right?
But he also how old were you?
When that happened, well, this is all between the ages of 9. This is 9, and even earlier than that. Actually, we're very young, but these stories are still like seared in our consciousness as he would tell us, because he would. In fact, we'd hear the stories more than one time. You know how that rolled.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But he would also talk about resistance, because he talked about one of the family members named Little Uncle, who just didn't fear white folks. And one time something happened and he went into town and shot out the clock. And so, I mean, but my point is that these are sort of stories seared in my memory in terms of what it was like to be in the South. And the other important part about it was the Cook family, because the Cook family was a very distinguished family, because out of that family comes Dr. Samuel DuBois Cook, who was the first African-American ever to teach outside of the South. And he has his chair is the distinguished, it's the chair. He has a chair in his honor at Duke University. Went on to, he was a close friend to Martin Luther King, actually. So the Cook family, and they were all, many of them were educators, and they were proud educators. And so that was an important part of my experience as well. Growing up with these educators, there was, in fact, well, one of his daughters is maybe I really shouldn't say that right now, given the political climate, but there's some good stuff happening with one of his daughters, one of the family members at this point. And so that's that all of this is a part of the experience. Now, my mother and father separated. It was very tragic, very difficult. My mother, again, was a very able, capable woman. But we went to Pittsburgh where we had relatives, and we went into August Wilson's Hill District. And I say that intentionally because I was raised in the Hill District. And in the Hill District, it was quite interesting to see my mother experience living really in a rat infested, roach infested. I mean, it was just, the conditions were very, very difficult. And here is many Black women have gone through this, trying to raise at that point two children. And Black women often are just too proud to, in those days, the question of equity was not very much in play. So even though she was supposed to be getting a little separation fee, I mean, she really wasn't that, wasn't enough and whatnot. And so it was very, very hard growing up in the Hill District of Pittsburgh. But it becomes important because you get a sense of what some of the institutions were like, even in those days. But the one point I wanted to stress is it was out of this experience that my social political consciousness is really forged, even though I was not aware of it then, because I was saying to myself distinctly, and I talk about this in my book, peering into the sky one day and saying that folks just should not have to live like this. Because
Mhm.
ultimately, my mother, heavyset woman, about 210 pounds when she was in her really healthy and strong, had a nervous breakdown and went down to about 140 pounds, right? Trying to raise two kids,
Oh,
against all of these difficulties and whatnot. And, we're in this rat infested, slum, 6 Shipton Street. And I'm saying that she's down there sweeping the floors. And I mean, I'm saying, what are you trying to do, mother? I mean, you can't, but there was this sense of trying to make something, to have something, and the aspiration to have a home. And it was just, you couldn't make anything out of it, but that was her aspiration, to do that. But in that neighborhood, if many of us reflect back, there were also many strengths in that neighborhood. And so one of the strengths was a place called Hill City. And Hill City it was a neighborhood center. But then it's interesting because when you look back now, when we talk about the circumstances of where we are now, there used to be many centers in our communities like that.
Mm-hmm.
So Hill City was a place, and it had a peer court in terms of juvenile justice. If you committed an offense, you would go before your peers, and they would sentence you to sweeping the floors for 2 weeks or whatever, all those kind of things. And two very important influences. One, there was a brother who was in the Marine Corps, and no doubt he had benefited from the experience of people embracing him, because this was a warm environment where people cared for you, right? And I know the names. I know Pronny Ford. I know Carl Redwood. I know them to this day because they took us in, and we were troubled, man. I mean, this is like you trying to figure out how the hell to live the way we was living. I mean, it was just like very, very difficult. But they took us in, and and so this guy comes. His name was Archie. And he says, posted a sign one day. He said, all young boys who want to become young men, we want you to report at such and such and such a day to become a part of this drill team. So some of us showed up. And that was a life-altering experience, because Archie, who I can only infer now was giving back because he had been influenced by that center. He took a group of troubled young people, young brothers, men, understood the basic elementary principle of pain, pleasure, psychology, and so forth. So the fact that we because in those days in many communities, the tradition of the boogie drill team and the drum and bugle corps was important.
That's right.
Because if you want to, you could show out, and the boogie drill was the boogie drill. I mean, this is our own way of taking, as we do as Black people, taking mundane stuff. It's like the blues. I mean, you blow it, and out of it comes this magic, right? Given who we are.
That's right, brother. Those drill teams go back to the Civil War.
Oh,
Reconstruction, absolutely.
Yeah, but so this was the part. This is this pomp and circumstance. But what he insisted on always was we couldn't do no boogie. You had to learn straight military drill first.
Yeah.
Discipline, working together. But the reward was then you could do the boogie drill stuff.
Yeah.
And then you could show off in front of the sisters. You know what I mean? You could but he turned that into, but you got to have good grades. You got to be able to do certain things. And so that was an extraordinary experience. And the other one I'll touch on quickly was the church. Because I was 12 years old, the steel town, and Pittsburgh is a steel town. I was baptized in Ebenezer Baptist Church, one of the great church institutions in this country, really. Reverend Casey. I mean, I didn't know all this history then, but this was and I remember at 12 years old getting baptized in this water with all these mill hands. So it was muddy water. By the time it was over. But that church experience became important to me because at 12 years old, I was the youngest delegate ever to go to at that point, the YBPU, Youth Baptist Convention in Philadelphia. Because there was a little something happening up in here in terms of some raw talent. And my mother gave me the freedom to grow and blossom. Her only requirement was you can do what you want to do, but you have to behave yourself. You have to be respectful and all those kind of things. So these were some of the influences, teachers, and a whole bunch of other things, that are important in that experience. But to carry the story on quickly, my mother couldn't sustain it. She couldn't sustain us. And when she had to break down, she had to make a decision because by now there are 2 other children in the mix. And so she made a decision that she would move to Indianapolis, Indiana, where she had family. And my brother and I would go back to Youngstown, Ohio. And so we went back to Youngstown, Ohio, but that was a very difficult experience because my father was vastly different than my mother. My mother believed in me. My father saw all of this running around. He's going to be a thug. He's going to be a hoodlum. Is all this kind of stuff. And so he was determined to rein me in.
Okay.
And so the very first day I got up and he went upside my head saying, you ain't coming. You ain't doing what you doing. So, man, I'm now in this conundrum of trying to figure out what it is. How do I survive psychologically in this? And it's very interesting because on the one hand, there was this stern, harsh man. But on the other hand, there was all this history about him too. There was all this, your word is your bond. You pay your bills on time. You have all of this stuff working. And yet for me, it's bottling up. But what I did was I sublimated. This is what we would call it today. And so I turned that experience with Archie in Pittsburgh. And at between 13 and 14 and 15, I created one of the most amazing youth organizations in the history of the city of Youngstown. I took the cadet experience and I transplanted it. And I emulated it. And so the neighbors, they would say, and these young kids, man, we would go to stores, Army, Navy store, because we also had cadet parents who then joined into the effort. And we would do chicken dinners and all those kind of things. And we would sell it and we would raise our own equipment and buy our own helmets. And I did the same thing. You had to do straight military drill first. But we added a component to it in terms of civic education. And we talked about learning first aid and camping and all those kind of things. So here we have about 30 or so young kids from the neighborhood. And I am the commander. I'm peer commander. So people are looking at this and say, this cat's going to be president one of these days. How is he doing that? But for me, that was a way of maintaining my sanity really in this situation. And my father, it was interesting because he would be saying, and so if they said okay, then he would say okay in some way as well. But I mean, it was just so. But anyway, it's a rich history, brother, and it's a rich history because what I recall and sort of reading through some of your questions and so forth about class and all that, I never really thought about it in class. So it is class. But what I do remember is in Pittsburgh, no motherless children, no fatherless children. Didn't matter. In those neighborhoods, people were doing different things. A lot of illicit stuff was going on, not illicit in moonshine, having card games. And unfortunately, sometimes it got out of hand and people were shooting craps and people would cut each other. I mean, some of that stuff happened too. Yeah. I also remember too, there was gang banging going on. And I say that because the gang banging went on, but there was nobody ever got killed.
Is it mainly territorial?
It was territorial to some degree and all of that, but it was tribal in the sense that it was territorial, but sometimes but the main thing is it was sticks and stones.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I only say that because people romanticize as if gangs never, but the difference is today it's deadly force and a whole bunch of other stuff that's associated with that. So we had to go through all of those kinds of experiences. But the bottom line is that out of the cadet corps and that experience, and of course, also, again, these influences, teachers who are in my life, neighbors who are nosy neighbors in my life, the Terrys across the street, always looking at everybody. But that was a part of the community, people taking care of each other. That I appreciated. And then going to church where, again, people who would look at someone like me and we had a steel worker whose name I shouldn't forget, but anyway, he was unlettered, but he was a superintendent of the school of the Sunday school. But he saw in me something, and he would have me come in and summarize the Sunday school lessons and things of that nature.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, in Pittsburgh, one of the ways I would kind of get over a little bit, they would have a contest in the B by PU, and you get $5 if you could do the Bible stuff. And I was like, I get that $5. So all of those things were working. And so eventually, there's a cousin who was in the NAACP, and he was in one of those neighborhood centers, and he was watching all this. And he said, well, these young men should be doing something a little different. And so he approached us, and he had us listen to speeches by Martin Luther King, speeches by Malcolm X, and persuaded me and some of us that we should become a part of the NAACP youth chapter.
Now, what year is this?
This is now we're talking 50. We're talking this would have been like 54, something like that, 54, 55, somewhere along in there, right? Yeah, somewhere in that range. So he persuaded us to he persuaded us to become involved. So when you start talking about social and political activism, then I take that cadet experience and all of those kind of things, and then I use it to begin to build my engagement in the NAACP. So I began in the NAACP. I was president of the Youngstown youth chapter. I subsequently became president of the Ohio Conference of Youth Branches, and ultimately the president of the entire region of Region 3. So that was my civil rights beginning and so forth. And the rest is, I mean, there's all kind of other influences and so forth. But it's important because those experiences do definitively drive me. I mean, I'm driven by that. I mean, this is what sustains my optimism. This is what sustains my utter determination that we are going to achieve liberation, because I see myself. These are, and I wrote this piece called "A Pledge to African People," and I talk about learn to teach, teach the bill, and by the way, another interesting kind of intersection in terms of how life develops. We had this little store called a colored store, and it was a little business. Eventually, it didn't make it, but it was interesting because here was this effort at entrepreneurship, and the next block up there were a series of families. One of the families was the Wilcox family, and old man Wilcox would come, and he was close to he was in the steel mill. But he became close to my sister. And by the way, my sister was quote unquote a half sister, which I don't like to use that terminology.
Yeah.
But she also became a surrogate mother in that circumstance. My sister Wileen, she became a surrogate. She's the one who helped maintain our sanity. I mean, through all of this madness. I mean, this pressure I was under. But it's interesting because later on, as things developed, one of the persons who that family was a family of someone who we should resurrect and know more about, a brother named Preston Wilcox. Preston Wilcox was he was a part of something called it was an Association of African American Educators.
That's right.
It preceded National Council of Black, an incredible brother, and out of Harlem, and he was a great archivist and all that. So I never knew him in Youngstown, but his family was in the next block. And so he adopted me. So when I got ready to put together when I make my conversion to Black Power and all that, I show him my plan, and it was Preston Wilcox who gives me the stamp of approval. Who stays with me and becomes a mentor and somebody who guides and whatnot. Yeah. So it's those kind of threads that are important to me. So yeah, I appreciate telling the story because when you see Ron Daniels today, for whatever I become, it is all rooted. All of it is rooted in my sense that I am obligated to give back. That my education is not my education. My education is not some singular achievement. That education would not have come without the contributions of literally hundreds of people. So when you read my book, for example, I give acknowledgments. People like, what is going on? I literally acknowledge probably 200 or 300 people, because I want people who never ever would get their names mentioned to know that
Yeah.
I care about them, that they did contribute in a way, and that I learned from them, and I contributed to them, and I've grown as a part of it. So I know that's more background than you probably wanted, brother, but
Mm-mm-mm.
that's
No,
that's
no, 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 no,
that's how
brother.
that's how
Brother,
it
see,
works.
that's what I pride myself on, is that I get people to talk about their background. Have you heard the saying that a great point guard, you know them in middle school, right? You can't take a person that's already in the NBA and make them to a great point guard. What I take from your story is that you became a great organizer, and that's your reputation nationally, is that you're a great organizer. And the story you just told, I see the roots of that in junior high when you
Mm.
put together the cadets.
Oh, there's no
And
question
that
about that.
tells me, and so that's good. That's why I want these stories so
Yeah,
that
but let me
people
but let me
understand.
just
Go,
but
go
let
ahead.
me but let me also just trace that a bit too, because what happened with that is what we built with the cadet corps, which was a very interesting kind of piece, because at first we were kind of laughed at because we were doing straight military drill. Oh, that's okay, all right, But then we were going to these contests, and then but we could also do both. But we were so precise, we were so tight that we soon outstripped the more popular. There was a group called the Legionnaires. In fact, we would tease each other later. We started outstripping and competing with the Legionnaires, and being successful. And so that gave us a sense of responsibility. But the other thing I'm so proud of is that then what we did was then carried on by others who picked up, and
Mm,
out of that. So I came out of Pittsburgh with Archie. We built a cadet corps, and then other groups built all the way
mm,
eventually to New Jersey, for one of the persons built a youth organization. So that branch. So you
yeah,
turn back and you say, here's Archie. You see what I'm saying? This is the thing
yeah.
that for
Oh,
me,
absolutely.
here's a guy.
Yeah.
I mean, I know nothing really about him. You know what I mean? Other than that. And I'll say this as well, because one of the great experiences in my life was having to be tapped by Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson to replace Ron Walters. After he wore Ron Walters out, he turned to me to wear me out. so, so because this man has incredible energy. So,
Yeah, yeah.
um, but he came to Youngstown to to take it to take me on. And so what I did was I sent for one of the living people who was still alive at that Hill City, Carl Redwood Sr.
Mm,
I brought him to that place and let people know, this
yeah.
is this man, this Hill City. This is what I'm about. This is who helped to nurture me and to bring me along. So anyway, yeah.
No, again, I really appreciate that story. Um, I want to move us to the fact that this is the 50th anniversary of the Gary Convention. And last week I participated on a Black Alliance for Peace panel discussing the 50-year anniversary and its legacies and lessons to be learned. And so I want to go back and see if you can talk to us about your role in Gary, the process that got 3,000 delegates, not people who just came representing themselves, but elected delegates. And if you can then just describe your experience there.
Well, it's a very deep experience, and really, it's 4,000 delegates and 4,000
4,000.
observers. That was the match, and it's really a phenomenal experience, because what I eventually did was take all of the collective experiences that we're talking about, and I built in Youngstown, because I left to go to go to graduate school, and it's a rich life, brother, rich life. But anyway, and so I return. I leave in the NAACP, even though I was always a part of the more militant wing of the
Mm,
NAACP, and I return, um, having converted really to Black Power. interesting conversion experience, actually.
Actually, I do want to. I either want you to talk about the conversion experience,
Yeah, I'm okay.
or I want you to come back
Yeah,
to it.
I'm working. I
Okay,
got you.
okay,
I'm gonna get there, but I gotta.
all
But
right.
I mean, because this doesn't happen in a vacuum either.
That's right.
Because
That's
I
right.
played a pivotal role in the Gary National Black Political
Yeah, that's
Convention.
right.
But that role is shaped by what we built in Youngstown. Freedom Incorporated, one of the most formidable Pan-Africanist institution. And I noticed you said it don't come out of places like that. Well, hell, we put Youngstown, Ohio on the map.
Yeah. See, that's how I first heard about you. I
All
was
right.
a teenager, and
Yeah.
it was what you did in Youngstown
Oh man,
in
we
terms
were
of
bringing.
community organization that you coming out of that small
Yes,
hill
absolutely,
town,
man. It
you
it
put
is
something together that propelled you.
it was, but all of that. But you see, it's all everything is built on everything. That it was translating that experience, and so we put Freedom Incorporated together. Freedom Incorporated creates something called the Midwest Regional Coalition. And every year in Youngstown, we'd have something called the African Cultural Weekend. Massive, I mean, unbelievable. And into that space would come people like the former, now deceased foreign minister of Namibia, Theo
Mm,
Ben-Gurion. We
mm,
had Tapson Mareri from ZANU. I mean, we brought people and Awusu Sudoku and Amiri Baraka and Mailana Karinga and Haki Matabuti and Sonia Sanchez to Youngstown. This little small steel town
that's right.
became a hub because we had chapters who are working with us in Canton, Ohio, in Cleveland, Columbus, parts of, we had 35 different, Peoria, Illinois, all across the Midwest. We had pulled people together. And so what emerged was, and people should understand this, that the Gary Convention does not emerge out of a vacuum.
That's right.
It emerges out of a period, and it would not have been possible had it not been for another event that people don't talk about and should, the Congress of African People in
Absolutely.
1970.
70, Atlanta, Georgia.
That would not have been possible without that. Why? Because we were in a period of ideological internal fratricide. I mean, we were like these young brothers was frying these handkerchief head Negro. I mean, we were talking smack, brother. I mean, these Negroes. I mean, we were full of ourselves and learning and and whatever. But I must say, one of the things that is interesting about Youngstown is we had a slightly different approach, which has kept us and held us in good stead to this time. But what happened in 1970 is, with the formation of the Congress of African People, which I was called to be a part of, not only because of Preston Wilcox, but because Baraka came to Youngstown and he saw what we built. He said, he's a good organizer. He said, I
Yeah.
need to incorporate this. So I become a part of the executive committee of the Congress of African People, when it was truly a umbrella organization.
Yeah, right.
And so therefore, was a part of the, along with Ntangalizi, Shanyika, and others, the Congress of African People. The reason why that's important is because the Congress of African People brought together everybody from Whitney Young, who was the late great president of the National Urban League, that tendency, the inside moderate tendency, to the person then who was called Halim Abdul Farrakhan. That's what he was called then.
Yeah.
That's what he was called. And so they were both there, and everything between was there. And the discussion was about how do you build operational unity. And I will never forget, Lerone Bennett Jr. was there. And Lerone Bennett Jr., he said, I am so thrilled to see my people coming together in this way. So Baraka played an instrumental role in that process. And so Baraka then took that, because the other thing that people should understand is not everybody, just like the disputes in Movement for Black Lives Matter, it is always electoral politics, whether we should or should not, it can't, I mean, all of that kind of stuff is going on. Yeah. Baraka was one who always believed in electoral politics, the possibilities of electoral politics, not in and of itself and by itself. He had a theory of Black power in terms of the control of cities, in terms of New York and stuff like that. So Baraka approaches Hatcher and he approaches Diggs, and they began to talk about the possibilities of doing a political convention in 1972, which was a presidential election year.
Mm-hmm.
You must remember that. And so they agreed, and it was miraculous because this was organized in about 120 days or so.
Mm.
And people and talking about the class, I mean, people pooled their dollars. Some of these folks who had resources put them together. But here's the key: what made it unique is, and you indicated it. I mean, there was a political agenda produced.
That's right.
But that political agenda it came every state, every city across the country. People were engaged.
Yeah, absolutely.
But Baraka insisted that there would be a tripartite leadership.
Yeah.
And out of that tripartite leadership, at least one person had to be a nationalist or a Pan-Africanist.
Yeah.
So therefore, in Ohio, because of the base that we had built in Youngstown, Ohio, little Youngstown, Ohio, and because I was a part of the Congress of African People, I am tapped to be the Black co-convener, of the Ohio delegation. And I'm working with Carl Stokes and Representative C.J. McGlynn from Dayton. Carl Stokes, the Stokes brothers built the formidable 21st Congressional Caucus, which bears study because it was really an independent political organization. Incredible formation. In fact, I refer to it now. And then C.J. McGlynn, it's interesting how people who were the funeral directors were often the people who had weighed political power because they could do favors and this and that.
Yeah.
So he was a funeral director. And he was the kingpin for Southern Ohio, these two. So I'm sandwiched in between them as the co-convener of the Ohio delegation. And we actually went through all.
You're in your mid-20s, early 20s?
Oh, by then, I don't know, but this is 1972. So
Yeah.
I'm
whatever.
Yeah, I'm it's about 30 or so in that range. We could go back and do the math.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I cite all of that to say that this was one of the most remarkable events in the history of our people. But it was connected to a long tradition, which we all teach, of the Colored People's Conventions that began in 1840 or so, 1830, 1840, and all of those Colored People's Conventions.
Yeah.
The traditions of our people coming together to say which way, to plot direction, because we've always been debating how do we move and how do we do. And so, and the uniqueness of it was that what was being said was we must have a political agenda. We can't just vote for people because they were, Black or white or whatever. And it was significant because it comes on the heels in 1968 of the election of the first two Black mayors, Carl Stokes in Cleveland, Ohio, and Richard Gordon Hatcher in Gary, Indiana. And Richard Gordon Hatcher was one of the sharpest, most brilliant political. He's difficult to get along with sometimes, but I love the brother. He was committed to his people in a way. And Carl Stokes was, well, their circumstances a little bit different, but from a political perspective, it was Hatcher who was the political person who was and he was blocked in because he couldn't grow beyond that because of where he was. Yeah. So they and then Diggs, funeral director in Detroit. But also in his mind, people have to remember, he was also head of the powerful House Subcommittee on
Africa. You damn right.
Absolutely. And so this guy, light, bright, and damn near white, his hair all slicked back and everything, but he was a powerful. So these three men pulled together. And what happened was city by city by city, we debate, discuss, and talk about what the agenda should be in the city. Then it goes to the state. Then to the state, it goes on to the national. And so when we get to Gary, Indiana, you couldn't get a hotel room. You had to be in some instances 25, 30 miles away. So I come in as the co-convener of the formidable Ohio delegation, but we also organized a nationalist Pan-Africanist caucus so that we would be able to figure out what to do, because there were some folks who didn't want to go. I mean, there were people like Owusu Sadoki. He was my dear beloved friend at that point and so forth. Hey man, what are we gonna? What we gonna? I don't think this. And Baraka said, "Come on in. We gonna make this happen." Now, let me also say quickly that 1972 really, and more needs to be studied about this. This was the high water mark of Black
Yeah.
nationalism and Pan-Africanism.
Yeah.
Because you not
Absolutely.
only had Gary, you also had African Liberation Day in
Yeah.
1972
72.
as
That's
well.
right.
Right, both
That's
of
right.
those events. So very quickly, what happened in Gary, Indiana, was a focus on not only electoral politics, but a focus on Black agendas. But people should be aware that there would not have been a Gary if there were not a Hatcher and there was
Yeah.
not a Stokes. There would not have been a Hatcher and a Stokes had it not been for Black power.
Yes. Yes.
Because people, Karinga says the key conscious and key crisis in Black life is the cultural conscious. You had to believe that you could win, that it
That's
made
right.
sense. So now there's a consciousness, and so people go into this convention, and you have these contending forces, and what happened was the consciousness of the people was really ahead of where many of the mainstream organizations
Hmm.
were, and even some of the elected officials. Now, in actuality, the elected officials had an agenda. Their agenda was to do what Ron Walters called leverage politics. It was to gather all these folks in Gary, come up with an agenda, and then say to the Democratic Party, you can't take us for granted no more. You see what we just did? Either deal with us or whatever. So if you hear some of the speeches, it's Hatcher saying, this is your last chance. And then Jesse Jackson getting up there, talking about, because there was a whole discussion about independent Black political party even then. And he
That's
gets
right.
up there and says, well, we working and it's like the baby woman having a baby, the water didn't broke. Out come the
Yeah.
Black political party. I mean, everybody,
Yeah.
but in essence, what was valuable about Gary was, and it was not without its it was fraught with tensions, because what happened was the agenda was too radical for the mainstream organizations on two accounts in particular. The issue of Israel,
Hmm.
because the resolution in that passed called for an independent Palestine. That was a no-no, particularly for NAACP Urban. I mean, they was on TV the next day. Oh no, we didn't mean it. So, and I'm not hating them. I understand in retrospect, but I mean, because they were dependent, right? And the
Right.
other one was the whole notion of community control of education,
That's right.
because out of New York, G2EUC and people like that were building on the notion of, look, why can't we have education where we are? Why can't we educate our own people? Education for liberation.
Now the
History.
Ocean Hill Brownsville
Oh, yes.
was 67, 68.
It was
And
in that
so
era.
independent
Oh
schooling
no.
comes, yeah,
Yeah. And
independent
that's
school
what's
comes out
flowing.
of that.
So
Yeah,
that's what's
yeah,
flowing, right? That's
yeah,
flowing
yeah,
all up in there.
Sibby.
And across the country, people are
Yeah.
starting to say, well, damn, all this integration and running after these white folks. Why can't we educate? So, and that ran against the grain of really what was actually an assimilationist tendency within the movement,
Hmm.
because integration really should never have been defined that way. It was about democratic rights, which
Right.
is different than assimilation. Integration, democratic rights, means you have the right to go wherever you want to go. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong. And even
Yes.
today, I have to critique people. They always segregate. No. There's a difference between segregation and separation.
That's
I
right.
can choose to live in a Black community. That is not segregation. If I have to live in a Black community by law, that's segregation.
That's we
Because
prefer to say apartheid, because segregation as a term is too soft, and people they don't focus on the power
right,
element of segregation.
right.
But yeah,
So
got
fast forward real quick. Let me just quickly say. So what happens in Gary is that we do pass the agenda, and there's a push for a Black political party, and I've got this reputation for being the mediator, the facilitator, and
yeah.
which I'm really proud of. And it was really out of the Ohio delegation that the resolution that was crafted to say, if we're not going to have a Black political party, we need to have a mechanism that moves forward. The person who made the motion for Black political party, I don't know if he even remembers this or not. It's my dear friend Mtimisi St. Julian from Louisiana. He rose up Black political party. The compromise was National Black Political Assembly, and I was the architect of that resolution. Also, though I was a behind the scenes player and so forth and so on, when you see the video, it's Nation Time. There's a moment in there where the Michigan delegation decides with Coleman Young, the soon to be the mayor of Detroit, because he was with the United Auto Workers and so forth. They were nervous about some of this stuff, but even then you had co-chairs. So Coleman Young was one, but Riley Smith was the other. So Coleman Young pulls some people out, and then and everybody's getting ruffled and so forth, and then and you don't see it. I raise my hand. Baraka says, "Ohio," and a voice rings out, "Mr. Chairman, the entire Michigan delegation hasn't walked out. Only part of the delegation has walked out. We still have we are and we ought to move the agenda." And it erupted. It's Nation Time. If you go back and hit that's what I did. I don't want. And then I was the architect of the resolution. I was the architect of the resolution that created the Black Political Assembly. So what happened was the politicians, of course, they left and they went to Miami for the convention. But what it did that lasted for a while and that we need to reclaim is not only the agenda, but the process.
Yeah,
the process of having people come together in communities to participate in deciding what the agenda ought to be. And we maintained that for a while. We actually maintained that for a while. And Ohio was a formidable base in that regard. And I got to quickly tell the story because we had to decide who would be, eventually I became president of the Ohio Black Political Assembly. So how is it that small Youngstown, you got the competition with Cleveland and the competition in the southeastern part of the state?
Yeah.
So what we do is we organize all the smaller little cities. We organize the smaller cities, and because Cleveland, which was the strong, they just knew they had the presidency locked up, but they didn't understand, brother. So we organize all the smaller cities and cut a deal with the people in Cincinnati. Ron Daniels becomes president of the Black Political Assembly. But in so doing, the way we did it was principle. And so Lou Stokes became one of my closest friends in the Congress of the United States. Carl Stokes came to Youngstown when we had Black political conventions, because that's how my advocacy has been characterized by that broad tent. So when you come to a State of the Black World Conference, even though it is convened by nationalists and Pan-Africanists, you see the breadth and depth, because I've always believed that we can't, you have to spread out and do that. So at the end of the day, we maintained those Black political assemblies across the country for a while. And in 1974, Diggs decides that, he's ready to move on. And so I became president. I was actually to be president of the National Black Political Assembly. And I guess one of the lasting legacy of Gary, I often say it's analogous to the Pan-African Congress in this regard.
Stop for a minute. I can't assume, I don't want to assume that my base, my audience understands the Manchester Conference, Pan-African Congress. So explain to people, give us the decade, right? And then tell us what happens there.
Pan-Africanism essentially germinated really in this, oddly enough, in the diaspora. Du Bois, Henry Sylvester Williams, a number of other people played leading roles into it. It really spread to Africa. There were 5 major Pan-Africanist Congress. There was some that happened after that. But they were characterized mostly by trying to figure out how to petition the colonial powers to accept us, respect us, and whatever. It was at Manchester that the decision was made, we ain't begging no more. We are going to go back to our respective countries, Kenyatta and Kwame Nkrumah and more, all of them. We're going back to organize to fight for independence. And then eventually that happened. So it's not a perfect analogy, but you roll into Gary with a relatively small number of Black elected officials. You leave Gary with people inspired. We are going back to our states, and we are going to organize political caucuses. We're going to organize to get engaged. And so you had an explosion of literally thousands of Black elected officials at all levels, county, whatever. So that's one of the lasting legacies that you can never ever take away from Gary. And for a period of time, you also continue to have these assemblies and whatever. But there were internal tensions that developed because the elected officials, um, the idea of breaking with the Democratic Party was something was very difficult for them to do, or the assumption that only electoral politics is politics, which is a whole nother story. We said no. There's all kind of ways you can do politics. Electoral is only one extension of it. But at the end of the day, in 1976, we put forth a strategy, the what we call the 76 strategy. Ron Walters and I worked together on it, and that strategy was to run an independent candidate for president of the United States, and we had hoped that they would either be Dick Gregory, or who had run before.
Right. He ran 68.
Yeah, it would be either Dick Gregory, it would be John Conyers, or it would be Julian Bond, or the Honorable Ronald V. Dellums. And in a way, we were by that time we had defections because some people left right after the convention, particularly around the community control of education, as well as the resolution on Israel. Though what happened was we met in Greensboro, North Carolina, immediately after that, and we modified it. We took out the independence for Palestine. We essentially came up with the two-state solution. But even that, you got to understand, for that time, that was still radical as hell for that time. But eventually, it became U.S. policy, the two-state policy. But that was just too much for people who largely still are dependent upon white philanthropy and sources and whatnot. So many of the elected officials split off, and also because they wanted to be, super delegates. They wanted it. It's fine as long as they could control it, but they had to contend now with the activists and the Pan-Africanists. Said, but no, we count too and whatnot. But there were some who held in for quite a long period of time. But by 1976, we made the decision to move for an independent candidate for president of the United States, and ultimately, Dellums, in a speech that was called "It's Not My Moment," he decided not to do it, so the assembly at that point really began to kind of go downhill. But I know as people are talking about conventions today, they talk about Gary without understanding that there were really it was Gary, there was Little Rock. In fact, we loved Gary, we loved Dellums because of the speech that he made in Little Rock. He posing the vital alternative. I'll never forget the speech. Maynard Jackson speaking. I mean, and then 1976 there was Cincinnati, and the last Black political convention was in New Orleans.
That's
in 1980, around the birthday of the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, when we declared for the National Black Independent Political Party.
Right? Now, I want to go back and dig into. We know about the defection of the major political electoral politic folk. But by the time you get to Little Rock, and especially, is it New Orleans? There's Cincinnati. The Baraka moves to the left to a Marxist-Leninist or Maoist position,
right?
And I just remember, I'm still at that point, 18 or 19. But the Black Scholar and the Black World ran the debate, the Marxist nationalist debate. So that stuff had heated up in 73, 74. What's the impact of that on the assembly?
It's an interesting kind of thing, Ashley, because there was a kind of rivalry that developed in the Black liberation movement between two seminal figures. Those two seminal figures on the Pan-Africanist side were Imamou Imeri Baraka and Owusu Sadoki. They were different camps.
Right.
Baraka is Congress of African People. Congress of African People shrinks from being, not shrinks, but moves to become a unitary organization.
Right.
Which means that some of us have to leave because we didn't join it to be a unitary organization. And then you had Imeri You had Owusu Sudoku with people like allies like Nelson Johnson and a whole crew of
Right.
people from the Carolinas.
Yobu Sobu
Yeah, and they create Malcolm X Liberation University.
University. Yeah.
And then you have Jimmy Garrett, who creates the Center for Black Education. That whole wing,
Right.
and that's the Owusu wing, primarily. Even though there was little debate and tension between the Center for Black Education, I'm just remembering that now, and the Malcolm X Liberation University.
Right, because Center for Black Education is more in line with Kwame Ture.
Yeah, because their whole thing was everything has to be on the continent.
Yeah.
And the Owusu's and the Malcolm X Liberation University said it has to be both. You build it,
right.
You have to build both, and so forth. And by the way, we don't have time for this now. I mean, the African Liberation, I was one of the founders of African Liberation Day. That's a whole story by in and of itself and by itself. But anyway, so there's this rivalry that begins to develop. And I only say that because, again, being the facilitator, a part of what I wanted to do, since I knew them both, I had been close to Owusu, almost to the level of our families knowing each other and all those kind of things.
Yeah.
Baraka came to respect me because he came and saw what happened there, and we had built a relationship. So I invited them both to an African Culture Weekend in Youngstown to begin to talk about how do we begin to bridge these differences. And a part of beginning to bridge the differences had to do with the sort of increasing move towards, this Marxist-Leninist ideological front. And I'll never
forget. But
Owusu's
making the same move.
Yeah, well,
ideologically.
Yeah, but at a certain point, first of all, there's their rivalry between them. I'm trying to cool that out, right? So that they can work together. And some of that began, and we actually began to work some of that out. And I will never forget, because that sister that I referenced, we agreed after the African Culture Weekend to meet in San Diego, the next session of this sort of facilitation. My sister died during that time.
Oh man, I'm sorry.
I got on a plane, flew back to the funeral, and I noticed because my Nova family was looking upside my head oddly. Buried my sister, got back on the plane and flew back to San Diego. Because to me, it was just that important to try to figure out how to bridge these differences. Because, and I say that because what happened was, this is the great tragedy of what happened in the movement, is that class, race, class, that debate, I mean, it shattered what the real possibilities were, and it needed not to have done that. And some of us, we created nobody will ever remember this. I remember we created something called FOPANO, the Federation, the Pan-Africanist and Nationalist Organization, was created as a umbrella to try to keep the discussion going between the people who were more or less the Marxist-Leninist types and others who were a little bit, and just to say, wait a minute, can't we now, while we're having this debate, can't we talk about specific pieces of work that we can do? Because with Gary at our back, and African Liberation Day, after African Liberation Day,
it blows up.
I mean, you have Owusu and Baraka being received damn near like heads of state on the continent.
Yeah,
I mean, that they're being received. I mean, this is like, because we are concretely now delivering for the liberation movements. I mean, it ain't a whole lot, but symbolically, thousands and thousands of dollars and whatever.
But also real pressure on the U.S. government.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I wrote my master's thesis on that.
Right. But so the question becomes, in that moment, how do you squander that moment? And what happens is, it's like, then I watched, because I've never I studied, philosophy was my thing. I mean, I studied Marx, Lenin. I mean, I've never been an orthodox Marxist, any of that kind of stuff. But I know race, I know class theory and all. I mean, we all studied Cornforth and all. I mean, I kind of had that. But these people, like, all of a sudden, they were racing to see who could be the most Marxist, Leninist, Mao Zedong, whatever. It was like, we're sitting in Youngstown, Ohio, because this is a little country folk. And what the hell is going on here? And I say that because inside of the assembly, it played itself out. It played itself out because people were frightened by it. And I will never forget, we had a meeting in New York, and Baraka came in, and some of us rose up and we said, well, you bringing that communism stuff in here is scaring people. And I may have been one of the voices who said that. And I'll never forget, I think it was in Tongolese of Sanyika saying, well, Ron, what you're talking about is right, but you don't want to be guilty of red baiting. Because I didn't mean to be red baiting. I was dealing with the reality is it was scaring the hell out of black. That's what I was trying to deal with. And I have an experience, by the way, because we sent some people from Youngstown up to Newark because we had, we were working with Baraka for a women's conference one time. And these are some average ordinary, some social workers or minister, whatever. They came back and said, Ron, what the hell? Why did you say, what the hell did you set us up? What is all that shit? What is this Marxism? What is that? What did you, I mean, because the point is, and let me just say this. I talk about what I call ODing on ideology. One of the things that we did in Youngstown, Ohio, where we were Pan-African nationalists, we did not walk around waving it. I mean, we dressed a certain way, but we didn't that was not like our everyday praxis. Our everyday praxis was to imbue and embed the values in the community so people could see it. And so people would actually say, well, yeah, I know they dress up and that stuff and all that, but them brothers, they work hard. Them sisters work hard over there. They educate the children. They're courteous. We didn't allow people to smoke and we didn't allow people to have drugs and all. I mean, so we carried ourselves a certain way. And because
wouldn't you say the same in terms of Baraka and at least his tendency, and probably Nelson Johnson's?
But they veered off. And what happened was, we got to talk about it a little bit later. But they ended up. It was like they were reading. Yeah.
I know where you're going. Yeah.
The Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, and then it was getting down to the Gang of Four, and it was like playing. It was like they were acting this out. And here is what was fundamentally wrong with it. I'm sitting there as a little dude from Youngstown, Ohio. I don't know nothing about this except if you apply dialectical materialism, it says you must assess the contradictions, the contradictions of the specificities of your own circumstance. And when you do that, you can't roll up against the church. Not in our circumstance, you can't do it. I mean, and so you can't apply. You just can't just drop down.
Right.
What
the
Lenin
move
did.
Would be that to maximize Black liberation theology.
Right.
That would have been the move. Yeah.
And whatever. But the tragedy is that it careened out of control. And in the assembly in Dayton, we ended up in a situation where actually Baraka, who had the forces. In fact, I was talking, we got a little thing we're working on now, and I used an axiom. I said, an organized minority can always outmaneuver an unorganized majority.
That's right.
So the underestimated organizer from Youngstown, Ohio, had to put together the coalition of different forces and groups. Because we had an economic conference in Atlanta. I'll never forget it. Bill Lucy, good brother. Bill Lucy, labor organizer. People walking up to people
Black
walking
trade union
coalition of Black trade union,
Black trade union
coming right out of A. Philip Randolph.
Yeah,
coming out of a socialist kind of background, really.
Yeah.
And everybody walking up to the microphone, pounding him. I don't understand. Are you for capitalism and scientific stuff? I mean, just doing this, that's just crazy. I mean, just mechanical stuff. And we said, hey man, we got to deal with this. And so what we did was, with Conrad World and some other people, we actually pulled together a kind of coalition of folk to say that when it comes down to structure and organization, we need to create a new formation. And in Dayton, Ohio, in fact, as you go back, you'll see something in Jet Magazine that talks about, unfortunately, the vaunted organization of Emir Baraka was defeated and he was unelected. And so his forces ended up having to leave, for which he and I got to continue to work a little bit. We never really forgot that, that was always kind of an issue. So yes, that was a problem, and this should never have been a problem. We should have been able to work through those issues. And eventually, because it got to the point where, we were no longer talking about a Black political convention. We were talking about a people's convention. And what I would say is, I ain't got no problem with a people's convention. Let's have a Black convention before we do the people's convention, so that it will always be driven and rooted in the question of, because we understand the nature of race and how pervasive it is. And race becomes a material aspect of the class struggle. I mean, I don't know much about it, but I'm just saying that it didn't seem to be complicated to me.
Well, you know a little bit more than what
And
what you're letting on,
yeah,
but
but I'm
I
saying I
think that there are
never.
a number of circumstances I think that fuels unhealthy rivalry that emerges in that Marxist nationalist debate. But in general, it was a destructive event in
Well, but
the
it was
history
also it
of
was
our
also
people.
it
It
was
was
also
preventable. Yeah,
yeah, and it was also infantile. Today we would call
yeah,
today it was called. I mean, people who
yeah.
and I we once had a conversation. I don't know whether he would admit to it or not. Dr. James Turn was witness to it because Awusha and I had been very, very close. It was very painful to see someone who I considered a friend, a brother, who now saw me as an enemy because I did not share the same ideological view. I mean, it was like, I
Yeah.
mean, and he, I mean, no, seriously, it was all of a sudden. I'm saying, how is this? I can't how could that be? I mean, even if we had different, you know, and I'm sitting here, I mean, I'm sitting here watching Cory Booker talk about his friend Ted Cruz on television. I said, hey, I can't be no friend but Ted Cruz. I mean, you know what I mean?
Thank you. That's another.
I
But
said,
you know what's interesting here is that we go down a few years, and Owusu takes back his slave name and moves to the right.
well, what happened was they ended up plunging off. Nelson and them, they went off into I forget which one of them alphabet organizations, which was
Yeah, yeah,
predominantly white, controlled white, or and maybe
yeah, absolutely.
maybe Asian or whatever. And they didn't play. I mean, I mean, it got to be a very, very, very negative situation up in
Well,
there.
they started beating people up, but also
Oh,
the Klan then murdered 5 of them. Yeah,
yeah, no, it got to be very,
no doubt.
it got to be very, very, very serious. And so then Awusa then, retreats and becomes a Howard Fuller again. And when I look at Nelson Johnson now, he's an entirely different kind of person, And I remember in 1980, Nelson Johnson, who was always one of these hard line. I mean, some people were just hard line. And when we had the National Black Political Convention in New Orleans, I mean, Nelson Johnson, I can't remember what he was objecting to, but he damn sure was objecting. He was objecting. He was just objecting and objecting. And but he's changed now. He's become a different. He's a minister now. He's and he's and we talk about it. But anyway, that was a lost opportunity in terms of the nationalist Pan-Africanist movement. Our inability to deal with class, race, class. And the other thing I would say about that, just in general too, just in terms of organizing, just in terms of how I approach it, I think that I think it was Spagnon who said the people will teach us how to organize them. They will teach us how to teach them. And I've always taken that seriously. And so I'm not into trying to see who's the greatest rhetorician of all time. See, I mean, we would sometimes wage war by resolution. We get in the room and, no, we need to change that to a comma, to a semicolon. And you need that. The socialism ain't enough. You need to make say it's a scientific socialism. At the end of the day, if you can't implement something, if you ain't got no power, but I mean, it's like it's an exercise. At the end of the day, what is it that you can do that resonates with the people? And I do not want to simply have an incestuous conversation with people like just me. I want to always expand the base, and so that's characterized, my way. And sometimes I get criticized for it because I consider myself as revolutionary as anybody. But to me, rooting what we do in the people. And one of the things that was very interesting with the contradictions and tensions I have with my father, the love, it wasn't a love-hate relationship, but a love-anxiety relationship in some ways. It's interesting that as I moved into the whole question of Black power and Black nationalism and so forth, and as he came to understand me better, one of the proudest moments I had was to see my father in his 70s decide to take a trip to Africa
Mm, mm.
and to tour Africa and to be met by folks because he really supported the Black power, he came to support his son in this way and understood what we were doing. And by the way, he had some of the stuff was good. He would say, he came to this practical stuff. Like, because I've always been rooted in the church as well. And he would sometimes say, well, Ronnie, he said, now, you remember Tabernacle Baptist Church and they love you there. Now I'm looking at the thing and you gave, I thought you gave $35 last year. But how you can't. And what he was trying to say is, there's certain practical things you got to do,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so I came out of the church. I left the church for a while because I saw the hypocrisy and all the stuff, and whatnot. But at the end of the day, one of the things that has also characterized my advocacy is always, because I am a believer, is surrounding myself with people of faith, with faith leaders at all times. The progressive faith leaders have always been a part of the advocacy and the work that I do. And my father would be proud of me now, because I give a good part of my income to the church today, in terms of, because he was right. He was saying it was at a practical level. He was saying, you can give what you want to get. He said, but at a practical level, these are people that you grew up with. These people love and admire, but you if you want them to, you have to support the people who supported you as well.
Yeah.
And whatever, but I digress.
Well, one of the things I would say that I thought was powerful that came out of that era and that moment was the notion that rather than leave the existing Negro organizations, transform them. And this is the argument. You know me. I'm a Marxist-Leninist.
Right.
But I'm committed to national liberation of our people, whether that takes the form of autonomy or complete and total separation,
Right.
or return to the continent. That's
Right.
for the masses of our people to decide.
Right.
But I'm fighting for self-determination.
Right.
But in that context, what I've always thought is that we have to work with our people, and we have to win our people to a position. You can't impose a position. Now, I have, like you, I believe fervently that my analysis is correct, but I also believe that I might be wrong.
Well,
And
yeah, and that's
that should
why,
humble you so
yeah,
that
right, right,
let 1,000 flowers bloom.
right, and that's why I always say, I use this when I teach my little basic organizing stuff. And I used to teach organizing class. I never learned anything from any of these orthodox. I mean, I just created my own playbook. And I remember that phrase, a couple of phrases. One that stick with me, because I mean, to me, there's a volume. There's certain things stick with me. Cabral sticks with me. But he said, the people do not struggle for ideas alone.
That's right.
They struggle for a change in their material condition. So that's why when you assess what the Panthers did, there have been many people, if they had just been strutting around with guns,
right.
Black people ain't doing no. But they had a breakfast program.
That's right.
They had concrete educational. They had a health center. So they were rooted in the community. So when you got ready to move on them, they may have some guns on, and they may have them hats on, but you're not messing with them because they ours. That's a whole different conversation. And people
and another thing people don't get is that the Panthers didn't simply repeat the arguments made by Marx or made by Mao, made by Lenin. The Panthers were innovative. So when Dewey creates the theory of intercommunalism, that is a genuine innovation in Marxist theory. Right. Built on tradition. And you can take what the Panthers did in terms of merging a African-American aesthetic and sensibility and interpreting the classics of Marxism, and I'm including Fanon, Nkrumah, Nyerere, and interpreting that and putting it in a context of what's happening in the U.S. in a way that appeals to our people, the working class majority of Black folk. That's different than simply coming into a meeting and quoting from.
Because what happens is, and with the National Black Independent Political Party, but even with the Assembly sometimes, and I tell people this all the time, when we said National Black Independent Political Party, man, people just came in droves to places. There'd be 500-600 people would show up, and in some instances that many would show up in DC and places like that. But you see what happened what happened was inside of those spaces, the line arguments would break out.
Yeah.
The people who were the Marxists and this and that, and then they arguing and fighting over the capitalism and not capitalism, and then you could, because at the end of the day, and I always say this to people, I tell them all the time, and even with the Black Radical Congress, I mean, I learned lots of lessons. If you're gonna do something, start with the people you agree with. Because if you're
Yeah,
spending time trying to work out what you're going to spend all your time on that. But the
that's right.
people aren't interested in that. They're interested in what are you doing to improve the material conditions in my life. Now you can do that and still argue, but if you're just arguing, I mean, okay, y'all go
Right.
on with that.
You got to put something on the ground. But
You
look,
got to.
the past is important. It informs where we're going, and I appreciate your diving deep into the guts of that history from your perspective. But I want to bring us to the present because your activism has continued to today. And so, as we shift to the present, I want you to talk about the organization you lead, the Institute for the Institute of the Black World for the 21st Century. And I want you to locate your discussion about IBW 21st Century in the context of what you're updating from the original IBW, right?
Yeah, let me quickly do that because I know we're running out of time. If we're not running out of time, we need to run out of time because I got some other stuff I need to
Yeah,
be
yeah,
working on. I got some other major tasks.
I understand.
But the genesis really, because in a real sense, I've been blessed to be involved with some of the most important political movements of our time, and I came to feel coming out of the Jackson campaign, which was an incredible experience, that we had tried to build some sort of these national movements, and from the ALD to the Black Assembly, the National Black Independent Political Party, and there was people were kind of exhausted. And so we came together and we created something called the African American Progressive Action Network. I called some people together after the Jackson campaign. I said, what should we do? I said, what are we going to do? And they said, let's just do 2 or 3 little projects we can work on. One project was saying, look, we think Malcolm needs to be uplifted. And there's a way in which people, and we said, okay, 1990, this is coming in. Let's make 1990 the year of Malcolm X.
Okay.
And let's organize around that. Number 2, let's resuscitate the idea, and not that they had been that long gone, but the idea of Black America, State of Black America conferences, which had been held in Cornell and other. Let's because our people need to be gathering. And that's against the backdrop of people beginning to drift towards race neutralism and some of those kind of ideas. No. We need. And then the final thing we said, we need some kind of institute. We need some kind of institute that will be African-centered, that will focus on the issues that Black people are talking about, because the Joint Center was beginning to move towards a more race-neutral kind of posture as well. So to make a long story short, we actually did 1990, the year of Malcolm X. Preston Wilcox played an instrumental role. James Turner, we did an incredible piece. 1994, 94, I guess it was, the first State of the Race Conference. We actually did this in Baltimore, followed by another one and whatnot. And then we also created a formation called the IFRE, the African American Institute for Research and Empowerment, because we were trying to figure out how to do something that would do training and various other things. And then, we decided that we needed to, that didn't really work as well as we wanted it to work, but we needed to still continue to try. So we decided that, because I've always been trying to look at historical dates. So I said, let's call now not a State of the Race Conference, but a State of the Black World Conference in 2000, which would be whatever anniversary, 30 years after the Congress of African People. That was the idea, to let younger people keep remembering. Well, we had no resources. It was tough. And so what we really did was we had to do it in 2001. But in the interim, we began to think about this idea of what an institute could look like. And we had a lot of conversations with folks who were a part of that process, including the person who had been the last executive director of it, but also Howard Dotson. A lot of conversations with him. Eventually, we also talked to Bill Strickland, who was not so much in favor of it, actually, ultimately, but also Vincent Harding. And they said, fine, and if you want to use the name, you can use the name, because they put it to bed. They had resuscitated. They had, they couldn't get funding and whatever. But we wanted to make it the first institute. The first IBW was incredibly important because it focused primarily on education. It really came out of something I don't know if it was called a Challenge of Blackness or whatever, but it was a piece put together by Lerone Bennett Jr.
Oh, it was indeed called The Challenge of
Yeah, right.
Blackness.
Yeah, I can't,
And
I
then he
don't
went
know.
on and did a book of essays, some great pieces in there that was also entitled The Challenge of Blackness.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it was about really essentially education for liberation. And so the Institute of the Black World initially laid the foundation for the Black Studies Department, the Black Studies movement, in terms of setting
Absolutely.
some standards and all those kind of things. And it was great at really these of thoughts. It's think tank. It was think tank stuff. I mean, really
Mhm.
bringing thinkers together to strategize, and people from as even Walter Rodney, people like that were all coming together in that way. So it was more oriented in that way. It was not as action oriented.
Right.
What we conceived of is we wanted something that would have that component, but would also be more action oriented and more engaged. And so we had the blessing of a number of the folks, and we even looked at even the logo as a modification of the original logo of the Institute of the Black World. And so we launched it based on a basic proposition that we had begun to talk about in the African American Progressive Action Network, which is a premise I put forward. And that was, as I traveled with the Jackson campaign, people were lamenting as I moved around the country, Brother Ron, man, these white folks is the worst white folks ever, man. They getting more rain. They're attacking us. Ain't no movement out here happening. We don't know what to do. I said, well, wait a minute. You're doing some organizing, ain't you? Yeah, but we around the education. Yeah, but y'all organizing. Then I go to the next city. I see the same thing. What I observed is the people who were doing it in this city didn't know the people who were doing it in the next city.
Yeah.
So it was disjointed. And in fact, it would be disjointed even in the same city. People might be doing some of the same work and didn't talk to each other. So I said, what we need to do with IBW is figure out a way to have people be in a conversation with themselves, that we are each other's best learners. And so it's not about us building a new organization per se. It is about how to aggregate people and put forth the whole notion of specialization, division of labor, and whatnot. So out of that is how IBW actually emerged in its iteration now, which really is, as you discussed it, is we see ourselves as facilitators. We see ourselves as convening, result-oriented convenings. And we fill the gaps. So if we see a space that needs to be filled, like the work around Haiti, we will fill it. The war on drugs, we didn't find Black people working in ways that we thought should be sufficient. So how we do this is we have these collaboratives that we structure. So around drug policy, we have what we call the justice collaboratives in 4 cities. And what do? People who are doing the exact same work or similar work, we say, can y'all at least come together 4 times a year, talk to each other, share with each other, and figure out what you can do together. It's also a notion of operational unity or unity without uniformity, and making that real and putting flesh on it. But people, you talk to each other, learn from each other. The adversary moves forward in the gaps of our disunity.
Absolutely.
And sometimes, I didn't know that was happening. Yeah, because we ain't talking to ourselves here. And so we have something called a Pan-African Unity Dialogue. Ron Walters talked about, Pan-Africanism, and he may have even I may have even took it from him. But here we have continental Africans, Caribbean Americans, Afro descendants from Latin America, all that, and we all in the same space. But the question is, we talking about Pan-Africanism. Can we practice Pan-Africanism here? So we have put together a formation that pulls together these constituencies to be in conversation with each other at least 4 times a year. And it goes on and on and on and on in terms of these collaborative structures that we put together. And quite frankly, even when we moved to the question of looking at reparations, we did similarly, to look at it not as a unitary formation of the Institute of the Black World 21st Century, but a collaboration, pulling together those persons who have been working on the issue and creating a way in which we could all come together and move in that direction. So that's kind of the essence of what the Institute of the Black World 21st Century is. I'm proud of it. It's only recently that we've gotten foundations to understand it, because they understand projects, and we're not a project in that sense. We are they call it a theory of change. Well, our theory of change is that the best way for us to change and move forward is for us to learn from each other, to not duplicate each other's work, specialization, division of labor. That
Mhm.
we do have assets in our community, but if we would just dig into them and aggregate them and pull them together. And that's just, I just feel so good when we see somebody says, you're doing this work, and do you know this person over here? No. Well, hey, let's learn from each other. Let's put it together. Let's critique it and whatnot. And that's what's driving the work that we do now around in so many different areas. And right now, one of the great centerpieces of it is the National African American Reparations Commission, which we were honored to be able
Yeah.
to pull together.
Brother, I am thankful that you were willing to take time out of a extraordinarily busy schedule, and we need to bring this to a halt. Uh, but what I want to do, if I can get you back on in a couple of months so that we can take up some of the other questions. And I've been asked by the audience if you need to go, if I'll stay on and respond to some of their questions. Um, and I'm gonna do that, but I don't want to necessarily burden you with it. But I got to get you back,
No, no, I'm
and
happy.
I
I'm happy. I'm
appreciate it.
happy. I'm happy to do that. And as I said before, when you first said you should put this out there, I said, brother, that's a long time. You know what I mean? Because it's only because literally as we speak right now, we are, and you notice this, we're
Yeah,
on the prefaces of moving HR 40, the
yeah.
municipal stuff in ways that Queen Mother Moore. By the way, one of the things about the Gary Convention, and Queen Mother Moore was my mentor. And you see her and all, get your reparations, get your
That's
reparations.
right. That's
And
right.
Queen Mother Moore was my mentor, and she's proud of where we are now. And talking about convening, this afternoon, I had the privilege of convening what we call the HR 40 strategy group. We have met on the idea of how to bring HR 40 forward. I think we're approaching 90 weeks consecutively. 90.
Mm,
Only
mm,
stopped
mm.
for some holiday or whatever. And Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee today spoke about that. She said, but we're on the brink of pulling that. And Evanston
That's
is
right.
there's a whole model. There's a whole series of cities. We're all in the middle of that. We're in the middle
Yeah.
of global stuff. So when I was saying today that it was just a matter that there's a lot on my plate, and a part of what we're also trying to do, by the way, and is to build out the infrastructure of IBW so I can do more of this.
Yeah.
I really enjoy doing this, but I have that nitty gritty kind of what I call a pertinent minutia.
Uh,
I have to also deal
Brother,
with.
right here, you are an organizer.
Yeah,
And there's something about people who come out of local organizing as opposed to people who come out of simply theorizing at a national and international scale, but ain't never done no local organizing. So I appreciate, you because of your capacity to organize. But I just got to get you back
no,
because
I'm down. You
we
know
got to
that.
get to
Yeah,
this.
yeah,
We
yeah.
got to get to this
In fact,
story of
what happened
reparations.
was though. See, we are doing cross generational transfer of leadership. We have a good core of people, and then they're trying to update me a little bit to keep my calendar different and all this stuff that I should do actually. And so when I agreed to do this, I actually agreed to do it over the time of we had to cancel our staff meeting tonight. We didn't cancel. I sent some no because I did it. We meet every Thursday, and I didn't have it on my calendar. And I said, and when you call, if you call and you ask, this is not even a question. It's just a matter of when can we get it scheduled. I mean, that's
I
all it
know,
is.
and
It had nothing.
I appreciate
No,
you, brother, for
that's
that.
it. I mean, that's the way I see that because this is my duty. This is my obligation. Because what you're doing is we're sharing, we're
That's
learning,
right.
and then we make errors, we make mistakes, and all that. But I feel it's important for a generation to know what we did, why we did it,
Mhm.
where the errors, as we see them, because they may make some of the same errors, but it's
Yes,
okay.
sir.
You know what I mean? But at least they know
Right.
what we tried to do and whatnot. So, yeah, we'll
Absolutely.
schedule another one, no problem.
Okay, my brother. Take care, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Okay, we got a number of questions, and I'm going to go through and start picking some of them out, and we'll give this another 26 minutes. All right. So, okay. So I'm looking for questions. Can somebody type a burning concern here? I know that much of it had to do with the debate over, or I should say, Baba Daniel's interpretation of the contradiction that developed amongst a generation of Pan African nationalists who were moving to the left and adopted various strands of Marxism, Leninism, Marxist Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. But I need a specific question to respond to. Let me stroll through here and see. Okay, I found one. There's a quote from Baraka, something to the effect that here it is from Tahir, that before he died, Amiri Baraka was saying that Obama's victory was both a product and victory of Black radical organizing, and we need to unpack that. And so I'm being asked if I agree with Baraka's assessment of Obama, in the sense that Baraka, by the time he had moved out of the Black political assembly and he was engaged in a multiracial project um, that became the Congress of a reformatted Congress of African Peoples, and then led to the League of, I can't remember the acronym, but I would argue that he's he's right in both senses, that the base that was built in the Black community coming out of Black Power, and particularly out of the Gary Convention and the Congress of African People and the Black Political Assembly and even MBIP, that laid a base in the Black community. Jesse Jackson's two campaigns. But I want to especially emphasize that when Baraka moves into that multiracial Marxist organization, that one of the things that we will see that is that manifests itself in terms of Obama's victories historically, right? The Asian American community were Republican. You begin to see them drifting toward uh, voting for Democrats, but with Obama's run, you see something like 63% of Asian Americans vote for Obama. The Latinx community, and we know we're dealing with real divides in nationalities that are that reflect class divisions within that community. Um, but Latinx as a group, they were moments where you get maybe 60, 70%, 60% that vote for Democrats. But in the 2000 election, they had moved back decisively toward George Bush. Well, I shouldn't say decisively, but the percentage that they had previously voted for Democrats had shrunk significantly, and they had moved back toward the Republican Party. Obama breaks that up and moves them decisively to the Democrats. So, in the sense that Obama built on the organizing by Black nationalists and the Black left, and that he becomes the beneficiary of organizing that pushes both the Latinx communities, I should say the Latinx communities, and the Asian American communities away from the Republicans and toward the Democrats, I would agree with Amir Baraka's argument. Now, we have to be clear here that Obama is the face of a tendency and a movement that he has vast contradictions with, meaning that what white America and the right feared was the darkening of the society, so the demographic shift, and those and the forces moving in on the basis that democratic uh, demographic shift of the U.S. They are to the left of Obama, right? But Obama benefits from that shift. And so the right focuses initially their interest in blocking what Obama can accomplish. But what they really do is begin to move to undermine and prevent and negate the Black vote. They move to further cement the Latinx community into the right. And they moved to attack the Asian American communities. But Obama is the beneficiary of forces that he himself would have been is in disagreement with. And I hope that's not too long-winded an answer. But yeah, um, let me see if there's anything else here as a question that's here already. But if not, if there are other questions and concerns, please put them in the chat and we'll take them up for the next 18 minutes or so. Okay, there's appears to be a question about Claudia Jones, and I'm trying to get a sense of it here. I see something from Tahir. I would say yes, because Jones struggled and organized in community and pushed her European comrades to recognize Black nationhood and Black women's impact on the movement. Let me see what the original question is. The original question is, was Claudia Jones' iteration of Marxism, quote unquote, applied Marxism? And I think the distinction here is that um, it's what Kim Il Sung would call Marxism with Korean characteristics. And so the question is, are you adapting scientific socialism to your particular circumstances? And it's interesting. Today, in the course that I teach, graduate seminar, Black Political Thought, the way the course is structured is that we focus on 5 people. You know, it's a 15-week semester, and we're looking at W.B. Du Bois, I should say Ida B. Wells, W.B. Du Bois, Claudia Jones is who we talked about today. Then next week we begin a series on Malcolm X, and then we end with Kwame Ture. Now the way the course is set up is that we read 1 week, we read the autobiography of a person. In the case of Du Bois, we get to choose, right? So we go with the last autobiography. The next week we read a biography of the person. Either a full-fledged biography, such as Paula Giddings' Ida, a Sword, or we read a political or intellectual biography like Alden Morris's work on Du Bois. right, on the sociology and Du Bois as progenitor of U.S. sociology. Um, then the third week, we either do a collection of essays or a monograph by that scholar. In the case of Du Bois, we read Souls and we read Black Reconstruction. So that's the nature of the course. But today the discussion was on Claudia Jones, and so we read there's an autobiographical section in the edited work, Carol Boyce Davies' edited work, Claudia Jones Beyond Containment. And so we read that in conjunction with Carol Boyce Davies' biography, Left of Marx, right? And then we also took up the rest of the essays in the Beyond Containment piece with an emphasis on the neglect of Negro women and the piece on Black nationalism. Um, and so I would agree that Claudia Jones's theory flows out of the circumstances, and she's applying a general Marxist framework. And it would be fair to say that when Franz Fanon said that whenever you are dealing with the question of colonialism, and I think we should interpret that to mean settler colonialism, internal colonialism, as well as classical colonialism, that you stretch Marx a bit, or you stretch Marxism, right? And so, in that sense, I would argue that Claudia Jones picks up elements that are clearly in Marx around race, nationality, and gender, and then she makes them more central. And so I would perceive Jones's work as an application. She never deviates from the thrust of Marxist thought. She broadens, she applies the analysis to the circumstances in which she finds herself. So much of it is an argument about what's happening with African Americans. And one of the things that you will see if you read A Neglect of Negro Women is that Jones looks like on the surface that she's doing what is commonly referred to as intersectionality. But when you dig in, what you find is that she's making a classical Marxist argument. She's simply applying that argument to gender and race, right? And so while one can talk about an embryonic feminism in Claudia Jones, because clearly she believes in the equality of women, and that's an argument. But she's filtering these things through the lens of class. And so it's important that when we read someone like Claudia Jones, to take seriously the way in which she presents herself, the way in which she represents herself. She says things like, I am a working class Negro woman. And so you see that the three elements are there, but look at the order. So yeah, I think that Claudia Jones is an excellent example of an application of Marxism to the circumstance of a people at a particular time. And let's be clear that Claudia Jones defends Black self-determination, and she argues that it is a guiding principle. And that's why she says that even in the period that she's writing, I think at this point we're in the 1940s, that you still should put forward the slogan of self-determination for the Black belt, and that she understands that this is not a slogan calling for practical work at this time, but it's a guiding principle that we should be striving for self-determination, for autonomy. Black folks should be building around concepts like dual power. So I think that So yes, I agree. Okay, the question from Nawadi Obi: are you thinking about vulgar feminism? And but actually, I think that's directed at Craig Bartle. Okay, um, I'll look and see if there are any other comments, and if not, we can move on. Let me go up to the top and see what we got. Okay, I'm not really seeing any other questions. I see a debate amongst each other. Okay, so all right, new comments. All right. Oh, could you talk about black support of Dems and the material standings of the masses of black people? Um, okay, that's a big question, but let me start with this question that, Dr. Daniels talked about putting together a series of conferences on the state of Black America. And I think one of the things that we've not done and made it accessible to our people is a real analysis of our contemporary condition. Now, I'm noted for putting forward this argument about a new nadir. And at the core of that argument is the notion that as the old Fordist economy was destroyed and supplanted by what I call financialized global racial capitalism, that is to say that contemporary capitalism is dominated by the financialized sector, right? It's global and it's racial in the sense that the overwhelming majority of people in the world, as Du Bois argued in Black Reconstruction, are the darker peoples, and that we are exploited by capitalism through its forms of colonialism and imperialism. Um, and oppressed, exploited and oppressed, because exploitation is something that takes place in the production relationship, but other forms of oppression uh, happen outside of that. So the kind of social discrimination that's connected to what Eric Olin Wright, and I would agree with Eric Olin Wright, as a kind of extra economic oppression, meaning uh, the kind of price gouging that takes place in terms of renting, home buying by Black folk in the market. See the my interview with Dave Crockett, where Dr. Crockett points out that in surveys, Black people identify the market as the place where they most experience racial discrimination. Now, where I'm going with that is this: that concept of the new nadir turns on making a distinction between what we call, or what I call, economic incorporation and economic marginalization, meaning that Black workers have largely been marginalized and converted into a subproletariat at a massive level, right? At a massive level. And at the same time, a tiny fraction of the Black community has been incorporated in the capital. So when we say that there are a handful of Black billionaires in the US and 235,000 millionaires, we're talking about a new phenomena, right? And that one of the things that does is that it exacerbates the class dynamic in the Black community, whereas gener- 3 generations ago, Black capitalists did not exploit Black labor. Today, you can't make that argument. Not only do they exploit Black labor, but they garner a large share of Black labor, right? Top 10% getting over 60%. So I look at economic categories, and then I look at political categories, and we're talking about political incorporation, but also political destabilization. And so, up under each of those broad headings, there's 5 quality of life indicators that I look at. And so, part of what I would say to this answer is that we need to take the most important quality of life indicators, every community, every Black community, and analyze the state of that local community. What is the actual state? We did that for Champaign-Urbana, where I reside. And one of the things that you find out in a place like this, that we're now trying to find a way to really get out to folk. One way is, of course, be my column this Sunday, but in nationally, African Americans, Black people in the U.S. make 62% of the white median household. 62%. In Champaign, Black people make 40% of white median household. So that in one sense, Black folks in Champaign are much poorer than Black people nationally. We can do the same thing in terms of home ownership. We can do the same thing in other areas, so that what we can show is that the disparities here are much greater. And so my argument is that we need to begin with a real concrete analysis of the conditions of Black people nationally and in each local community. And that would be the way that I would respond to that question, and that then lays the foundation for a massive political education project, but organizing, because we're now able to pinpoint directly the ways and the forms in which we see that those disabilities, right? And someone's putting in the chat right now, CDC, childbearing Black women are 14% of the population, but obtain 36% of abortions. They have the most. Okay, I'm not going to go down that abortion thing, because I think that the woman has the right to choose. And it's more important here to talk about the fact that Black women give birth to low weight children, premature children, and how that affects folks over the course of their life if they live beyond the age of 5. At any rate, it's 8:58, and we're going to move toward bringing this to a conclusion. I thank everyone for watching today, and I thank you for staying on while I attempted to respond to some of the questions in the chat. So let me move to playing our credits. And again, thank you.